While the maids were holding the young girl by force, Grazia poured some kind of potion into her mouth. The girl tried not to drink it, but she had no other choice at the time. The red-haired beauty said that she would be honored to die in Grazia's place. She hoped that the girl had enjoyed the luxurious life that Grazia had arranged for her in the last few months. The girl wanted to object, but when she opened her mouth, she realized that she had lost the ability to speak. She realized that this was probably the result of the potion she had recently been given. She sat silently and watched the maids skillfully dye her hair red. Tears were streaming down the poor girl's cheeks. When everything was ready, Grazia even clapped her hands with joy. They were like two peas in a pod. She never thought that she would ever thank her father for his closeness to that woman. But the ceremony was not long in coming, so it was time to go. Gracia angrily filtered through her teeth that she hoped the meeting with the sun god would be unforgettable, and that she was glad to meet them. The broken and desperate girl with red hair wanted to say something, but she couldn't. So only tears could tell us about her state of mind at that moment. The servants dragged her out of the room by force. On the way, she could only mentally say that she could neither speak nor control her body. So the girl walked on doomedly. They were already approaching the arena, which was packed to the brim with people. Of course, no one wanted to miss such a spectacle. All she could think was that she didn't want to die. He was screaming like a madman. They were expecting an incredible sight. The high priest of the Hellenistic Empire, Eunuchus Mundus, loudly announced to all those present that today, as he had promised, he would sacrifice his first daughter to the gods. He kept all his promises, no matter how much it hurt him. When he made his speech, a tear came to his eye, but the decision was already final. Eunuchus Mundus looked into the eyes of his eldest daughter. Their eyes met. Tears were in her eyes, but her daughter was silent. As much as it hurt him at that moment, he only mentally said goodbye to Gracia and continued the ceremony. The girl's eyes only begged for mercy, but she could say nothing. All she could think of was that she was not Gracia. She was Radana. But it was too late. No one heard her. Her body was already tied to a pole in the town square. When the place for the sacrifice was set on fire, the only thought that pulsed through her mind was that she did not want to die and wanted someone to save her. There was a sacred temple on the eastern edge of the empire. It was the place where the stone mountains met the blue sky. In the temple, a black panther was lying on the floor near the throne. It was waiting for an order from its master. Gino's devoted servant flew into the throne room and told his master that the solar festival was almost upon us, and that His Highness would have his head cut off if Orazio did not appear there again. The third son of the sun god, Orazio Lumen, was finishing another glass of wine in a hurry, but Oration calmly replied that the servant should not worry, because he would kill him before his father. Gino replied that although he had the ability to be reborn, it was still not a pleasant event. But the solar eclipse was unavoidable, and the solar festival was about to begin. The sun god, the ruler of the empire, Povius, had 3 sons. During a solar eclipse, the vassal state of Hellas must sacrifice to each of the princes. The most beautiful virgins are chosen as victims. In Powys, there is a belief that the prince of the solar empire will one day meet a girl who will be immune to flames, and the result of their union will be an omnipotent deity. Because of this stupid fairy tale, the princes of Povius are forced to listen to the screams of beautiful girls every year while they burn alive on the day of the solar eclipse. Every time during the solar festival, Prince Orazio is surprised that people can shout so loudly. He neither asked nor wanted such sacrifices on this day. Gino hurried the prince to make a decision. He made an ironclad argument that His Highness would demand a personal meeting if the prince refused to sacrifice, and that he himself would be thrown into the abyss. Gino's words forced Prince Orazio to rise from his throne, although he really did not want to do so. As the prince approached the exit, he ordered the servant to tell his father that he would be making a sacrifice at the Sun Festival today. And finally, Orazio added that Gino should tell his father that today would be the first and last time. Gino's servant was eager to see the sacrifice with his own eyes, so he shouted from the balcony for the prince to bring him along. But the young prince had no time for the intrusive servant. Another victim of stupid superstition was waiting for him. When Orazio found himself in the sky in front of the sacrificial square, the fire was already in full swing. When he saw the girl tied to the pillar in flames, hundreds of thoughts from the crowd filled his head. Poor thing! Rest in peace, Gracia! She was so beautiful! Orazio once again wished he could read other people's minds. When the people saw Prince Orazio coming, they were happy to see him and praised their god. Orazio mentally noted that he should have appeared after the burning. Prince Orazio had been told that he was to lead the ceremony, so there was no need to wait. Orazio stepped into the square and went to the girl on fire. When Orazio was close by, he asked if her name was Grazia, and then said that she must have some kind of divine power if she was still alive, adding that he never wanted to accept a sacrifice. The girl just looked silently into the eyes of her executioner. Only tears flowed down the young girl's cheeks, but the prince could read minds, so he began to understand what she had to say to him. And the girl just silently shouted to the prince that she was not Grace and that this should not bother the heartless animal in front of her at all. Gino's servant was furious, and he could not even comprehend how Orazio dared to bring a human sacrifice to their palace. But Prince Orazio didn't pay attention to his servant's grumbling. He calmly told him to do everything possible to ensure that the girl survived, because the prince had to check something. But Gino couldn't understand why he would waste his divine powers on a miserable human being. He tried to warn Orazio that he had gone against his father's will, and that was serious enough. Orazio merely asked if the offender could really be tried for violating the will of the sun god. And Gino confirmed the assumption. The angry Orazio shouted that no one in the world can judge Orazio because he is the horseman of justice in the heavenly palace. And this prohibition also applies to Sol Lumen, the sun god and father of Orazio. Frightened, Gino decided that he would not be able to argue with Prince Orazio today, so he decided to examine the girl's body. When Gino saw what he had to work with, he broke out in a cold sweat, because the girl had almost turned to ash. It was impossible to look at the girl's burnt body without disgust. But Gino was not one to be intimidated, so he began to work his magic. A few minutes later, the girl's body was free of any signs of recent burns. A beautiful young girl with blonde hair was lying on the bed. After the hard work of restoring the burned human body, Gino breathed a sigh of relief. He told the owner that it would take some time for the girl to regain consciousness. Gino warned Orazio to get rid of the human body as soon as possible, so that the stench of the human body would not have time to spread to the heavenly palace. But their conversation was interrupted by the announcement that an ambassador from the emperor's palace had come to visit them. Orazio mentally noted that he hated being interrupted, and Gino immediately ran to hide the girl. When the ambassador entered the hall, he said that Her Highness was happy to hear that Orazio had attended his first festival and had given him some gifts on this occasion. But Orazio did not want to hear about the gifts. He stood up from his throne and ordered them to leave immediately. Her Highness's ambassador was simply stunned. He had never been treated like that during his tenure. The ambassador tried to justify himself. He reminded us that he was Her Highness's ambassador, and no one had the right to treat him like that. He came here to show respect. It is the law and tradition of the gods. But Orazio seriously noted that it was an incredibly wonderful day, and if the ambassador did not leave, this would be his last day. The ambassador immediately felt the colossally burning gaze of the angry Prince Orazio. The ambassador had no strength to resist the power of the young god's piercing gaze, so he shouted to the maids to run away as quickly as possible and quickly left the palace. Gino, watching the ambassador and the maid quickly flee the palace, said that Her Highness and the Pyros family would not forgive such treatment of their ambassadors and would recall this insult at the right opportunity. Orazio said that he didn't care about these intrigues. He just wants to live in peace and freedom, and the imperial family should not interfere in his personal life, so let them keep all their grievances to themselves. Gino noted that the prince should decide how to live his life, but since he has already attended his first sun festival, it is time to think about how to become a real man. But Orazio, with a snap of his 2 fingers, made Gino's servant fly as far as the eye could see after these words. Finally, he added that he should inform the prince when the girl woke up. At the time, Radana was suffering from a terrible nightmare. In that nightmare, the girl was ruthlessly grabbed by the hair and dragged into a dark room. When she fell to the floor, she begged for mercy and pardon. But in response, someone angrily shouted that she had no right to run away and resist. The priestess asked her guards if these were all the children they had managed to catch and received a positive answer. The poor girl only begged for mercy and appealed to the powerful priestess Grace to save her from this trouble. At that time, the priestesses reported that they had managed to capture and deliver another young girl. The priestess examined the newcomer, asked if her name was really Radana, and offered her to rest and eat. After that, Radana was imprisoned in the church tower. There she ate, slept, and took care of herself. She wondered why Grace had brought so many beggars to her temple. But then Radana concluded that the sun god only grants blessings to good people, especially when you are about to be burned on an altar because you are about to be sacrificed. Radana felt very sorry for Grace, because she was soon to be sacrificed to the sun god so that he would continue to protect people. The priestess Grace was responsible for maintaining the sacred flame. It was said that she was able to light the fire with the help of divine power. She was the first priestess of Hellas, Gracia Mundos. Radana began her day with prayer. She sincerely thanked the god of the sun for allowing her to lead a mundane life. In a moment, the door to Radana's room opened and a maid appeared on the threshold, saying that the girl was to be taken to the high priest Eunuchus. But first they had to change the color of her hair. Radana didn't understand why this was necessary in her heart. She liked her own color very much, but she didn't dare to argue with the priestess. A few hours later, Radana, dyed her hair red and dressed in an exquisite outfit, walked the corridors of the temple accompanied by maids. When she looked at Grace, she realized that she looked like 2 peas in a pod. But Radana had no idea why the priestess wanted to do this. Radana followed the maids in silence and tried not to think about this phenomenal resemblance. When she entered the palace hall, a servant loudly announced that the priestess Grace had arrived to see the venerable high priest Eunuchus. The poor girl's mind was all in a tizzy at this news. At that time, the high priest Eunuchus was washing his hands and was about to go to bed. So he asked what brought Grace to him at such a late hour. Radana was completely confused. She almost fainted at that time. She didn't know what to say to the high priest, Eunuchus, so she began to stammer. At that moment, the real Grace came out from behind the hall column and said that she was here. She had a joyful smile on her face. Radana fell to her knees in front of the honorable people and greeted the priestess. The surprised father was stunned that he did not recognize his own daughter a moment ago. Gracia was very happy that Radana was not recognized by her own father. She cheerfully chirped that she had been looking for a suitable double for a long time and had finally succeeded. When her father asked her what Grace meant and why she needed a double, Grace painfully grabbed Radana's hand and showed the high priest her arm. She pulled the poor girl's arm closer to her father and showed him the brand of the Mundos family burned into her skin. She said that her mother was right after all. The high priest Eunuchus immediately recalled the distant past and thought that he should have killed them at the opportunity. He told Gracia out loud that it was his terrible mistake. Gracia turned to Radana and asked her what she thought about their resemblance. She also said that she had heard that Radana's mother was a priestess who served the sun god. Radana bowed her head in shame, but Gracia continued to speak of her mother as having pale yellow hair and a charm that attracted men from all over the world. But when the high priest was ashamed to hear such comments about his past love, he ordered his daughter to stop talking, because now they should be concerned about the life of Grace herself. Gracia happily informed us that she had already taken care of her future, because tomorrow at the festival, Radana is to take her place at the altar. Then, Radana finally realized why she had been taken care of so much all this time, why they had dyed her hair. It was all so that she could die instead of the priestess Grace. In her dream, Radana relived the recent horrors of her execution, and the last words of Grace, who said that Radana was born only so that she could die instead of the priestess Grace. Deliriously, she reached out and grabbed the cloak of a man who had not left her bedside for a long time. It was Prince Orazio Lumen. Orazio realized that she was beginning to come to, so he took her by the waist and lifted Radana closer to him. When the prince examined her closely, he concluded that she was only human, but her hair color resembled liquid gold. When Orazio touched her body, he realized that it was on fire. At that time, the girl began to slowly open her eyes. Radana could see a vague male silhouette in front of her, but she did not recognize who it was. So she whispered quietly, asking who it was. Orazio raised a glass of drink and brought it to the girl, whose body was burning with heat. The glass came close to the young beauty's lips, forcing her to take a sip of the liquid it contained. Radana's mind immediately recalled a picture of 2 maids holding her by force in a temple room, while a priestess poured potions into her. Her body still remembered perfectly well what happened after she drank the potion, so her lips immediately tightened and she refused to drink the liquid. Then she knocked the glass out of Prince Orazio's hands, and half of the drink spilled on the floor. Orazio said that the girl needed to drink immediately because otherwise her body would be dried to death by the sun. But Radana was adamant and refused to drink the liquid. Orazio insisted and persuaded her to drink the liquid for her own good. After a few minutes of struggling, Radana managed to break the glass, and the liquid was almost all spilled. Her clothes were wet, and drops of liquid were dripping down her body. But Radana still asked not to be forced to drink the drink. Orazio was also wet, with drops running down his torso. He told the girl that her stubbornness had been cute at first, but now she was starting to piss him off, so she had better not try his patience. Then he decided to give the foolish girl a drink in another way. The prince himself drank a mouthful of liquid from that glass. Then he took her by the chin and brought her as close to his mouth as possible. When the girl opened her mouth in surprise, Orazio deftly poured the contents of his mouth into hers. Stunned, Radana obediently swallowed the liquid. By this time, the girl's eyesight had fully returned, and she could see his face clearly. She immediately noticed that he was a very handsome young man. When she got up the courage, the first thing she asked was who was in front of her. But Orazio only replied that he was somewhat disappointed that this person did not remember who he was. The prince came closer to the girl and said that he was a heartless animal, if she was to believe her own words. After being reminded of the heartless animal, the girl's mind immediately conjured up a picture of her recent sacrifice when she spoke these words to the Sun Prince. Then she asked the man standing opposite her if she was really alive, since she could talk to him. The prince replied that he would not say so, and she did not look dead either. Orazio said that this should not be forgotten, because the family of those who offended the sun god would suffer from his wrath for the next 3 generations. When the frightened girl hid in the corner of the bed after this prophecy, she thought to herself that she would hardly see her great-grandchildren. Radana eventually regained consciousness and fell to her knees before the sun god. She apologized for what she had said and begged him to forgive her for the sins of a poor girl. She almost burned alive to death, so she had no desire to suffer in hell forever. Radana begged to bless her with her love and save her from eternal suffering. Orazio was already tired of listening to the young girl's pleas, so he came closer to her and took her in his arms. The Prince of the Sun went to the bed and carefully laid the girl on it. But as soon as Radana's body touched the bed, she immediately lost consciousness. He could not believe that the person was so weak. Orazio stood aside and admired the beauty of the beautiful woman lying unconscious on the bed. The following thoughts were running through his mind. They, the sons of the sun god, must constantly watch over and guide people. The reason for this close supervision is only to make people worship the gods and fear their death penalty. Human life is short and worthless. But this girl was the first person who dared to look him in the eye. And there was something else that made the prince both delighted and curious, and that was that he could not read her thoughts. Although he had been able to read the thoughts of all living beings until now, Orazio noted to himself that it would be a pity to kill this girl right now, so he decided to let her live for now. While the girl was lying unconscious in her bed, Orazio went to solve urgent issues. The first thing he did was to call a maid and order her to keep an eye on Radana so that she would not make too much noise. Finally, he ordered the maid to treat the young girl with respect, because he needed her alive for the time being. When Gino came to Orazio's chambers the next morning, he was simply concerned about his master's actions. He asked him to explain why this man was still alive. Orazio was sitting on his throne, petting his panthers. He ordered his servant to be quiet. It was his decision to let the girl live. But the servant was worried that someone would smell her. But Orazio explained to the servant that he himself had suggested that the prince quickly become a real man. So why did he now panic? These words made the hairs on Gino's head stand up. He even began to doubt that his master was sane. Gino asked if Orazio really wanted to be close to a human sacrifice. Then Orazio said that he was joking. Gino admitted that he had believed the prince and asked when he would get rid of the man. The servant hoped that the prince would not keep him as a pet. Gino made a strong argument that they could not leave the man alive, even if His Highness agreed to it. Her Highness would not give it to the prince. And if Her Highness sends another ambassador, the person will die immediately, so they have to kill him before. After listening to his servant, Orazio recognized that Gino was right. The servant was glad that the master had finally listened to his servant and suggested that the man be killed immediately. But Orazio had his own thoughts on the matter. He wanted to spend the night with this beautiful girl as soon as possible. Gino covered his ears with his hands and just kept saying that he hadn't heard anything like that. But Orazio said that Gino's audacity amazed him and asked if Gino wanted the prince to treat him like the other fools of their kingdom. But Gino denied that this would have been the ultimate in cruelty on the part of Prince Orazio. Orazio squinted his eyes and looked intently at Gino. Then he said that no one would know anything if the servant kept his mouth shut. But Gino really wanted an answer to his question about how long the prince was going to hide the human girl. Prince Orazio was very different from his brothers. His hair and eye color indicated that he was born to a mortal woman. Since ancient times, demigods have not been considered full-fledged, even if one of their parents was a higher deity. As a punishment from God, many of these people were killed or poisoned so that no one would know about their existence. Despite all these obstacles, Orazio managed not only to survive, but also to become the prince of the empire. He inherited his father's fame and was born with the ability to read the minds of others. That is why no one dared to challenge him, not even the sun god Sol. But his family was waiting for him to finally become a man. But Gino denied the prince's claim. Although his family was waiting for him to become a man, no one wanted a human to be his partner. But Orazio continued to calmly pet his cat, which only purred in response. Gino asked if that was what Orazio was trying to do to get his title revoked. To become a prince after coming of age, the heir must marry a representative of a noble family or a higher nymph and consummate the marriage. Someone who supported the empress and the nobility and made a list of potential brides for Prince Orazio to control him. But Orazio wished to give up his rights to the throne and enter into an alliance with a human being. Gino racked his brains a bit and came to the conclusion that even if something were to happen between them, Orazio is the only judge of heaven. Emperor Sol will not be able to take away his title of prince. Gino still insisted on his own way. Orazio should not get close to a human being because it was wrong. But Orazio exhaled and said doomedly that he would agree to anything if only his family would leave him alone. The devoted servant warned his master that he could be expelled from heaven for such an act. But Orazio poured himself a full glass of wine and said that this was what he wanted most. Radana woke up feeling the sun's warmth. When she opened her eyes, she wondered if she was dreaming, or if God had taken pity on her and sent her to heaven. Then she looked down at her hands. They were tightly tied. Looking up, she noticed Orazio sitting next to her on the bed. The prince asked her what her name was, since it wasn't Grace. And the girl said that her name was Radana. The sun god repeated this name, Radana, and the young man liked it. Then the young man introduced himself and said that Radana could call him Orazio. The young girl asked not to kill her and to untie her hands. Orazio, of course, said that he would not kill the girl if she promised him not to lose consciousness in the near future. When he untied the girl's hands, she stood up and immediately bowed in worship before God. Orazio took Radana's chin and gently lifted her head. He told her that she shouldn't do that and that she should hold her head up. He asked her to look him in the eye, and Radana complied. When their eyes met, he said that eye contact should be maintained during the conversation. Orazio smiled at the young girl with satisfaction. Radana was once again convinced that the young man was surprisingly attractive. Orazio continued the conversation and told Radana that he had decided to give her life. The surprised girl asked if Orazio would really pardon her, and the young man assured her that he would certainly pardon her and even make her immortal. But in return, she would have to spend one night with him in his bed. Radana turned away from the young man in fright. She did not want to agree to this. The conditions he was offering were too harsh. She said that she did not want to be immortal. Then Orazio said that Radana was very brave to dare to refuse the sun god. Orazio got up from the bed and, leaving the girl's room, told her to get some rest and gain strength because she was now weaker than a mouse. When the door to the room closed, the girl sat on her bed in shock and began to think about everything. I immediately recalled the words of her own mother, who constantly told her to protect her virginity at all costs. Tears stood in her eyes. She was confused and scared. All she could think of was that although he was God, he was still a man. Of course, his words were sweet as honey, but he would immediately turn the girl into a tree or a stone if she failed to please the young man. The girl was distracted from her heavy thoughts by a sweet aroma that resembled the smell of flowers. When the girl turned her head, she saw a female creature appear in the room from which this pleasant scent emanated. Radana was not prepared to see anyone else in her room besides Orazio, so she screamed out loud in fear. The creature calmed the young girl down and asked her not to make a fuss in the heavenly palace. A young girl greeted Radana. She was Nika, the shortest water nymph. In her family, there were 19 other children younger than her. Nika moved closer to her mistress's bed and said that she had brought her some water. It would be an honor for a nymph to serve His Highness's first partner. But there was one but. Radana refused to take water and food. It is a well-known fact that mortals cannot live in the heavenly palace for a long time. The fragile bodies of mortals are drying up. They cannot withstand the excessive heat of the sun, so they must have food and drink to survive. Nika sat down on the edge of the bed next to her hostess and said that Radana needed a drink. The nymph put a glass of water in Radana's hands and said that it contained the spiritual energy of the third sun prince. The nymph did not understand how anyone could give up such a treasure. After all, the holy water, infused with the energy of Prince Orazio, was considered the most important value among the nymphs of the Tesca Palace. Radana asked sadly what would happen if she drank this water, and the nymph explained that the hostess would become healthy and beautiful, like the goddess of the Povius Empire. Radana invited Nika to drink the contents of the bowl herself, but the nymph did not even dare to think about what His Highness had given Lady Radana. Then Radana drank the holy water to avoid upsetting Nika, and the nymph suggested that she start eating tomorrow. But Radana just shook her head. She wasn't going to eat. Well, then the nymph at least offered to drink water so that Radana would not refuse water. The nymph thanked Radana for agreeing to drink the water and sat down to offer to braid her with fragrant flowers. As the beautiful Radana sat with a glass of holy water in the middle of her room, the nymph skillfully wove beautiful flowers into her hair. Radana's beauty sparkled with new colors. A pleased Nika told her mistress that in heaven the girl was weaving flowers into her hair as she prepared for her wedding night. After these words, Radana drank the glass of water out of his hands. Orazio was sitting on a throne in the middle of his palace, angry. He was in a bad mood. An anxious maid appeared before him and informed His Highness that Lady Radana had agreed to drink the holy water today. The angry Orazio shouted that if she was only here for this message, then she could go to hell. And the nymph instantly turned into drops of water and disappeared. The human woman who had interested Orazio so much had been refusing to eat for several days in a row. She drank only holy water. It was clear to everyone that she would have died on the first day if the skilled healer Gino hadn't been there. Orazio knew that Gino was somewhere nearby, so he ordered him to show himself immediately if he valued his own life. Gino jumped out in the middle of the hall, scared, raised his hands in the air, and shouted that he was just passing by. Orazio asked why Gino was passing by at the very time when the prince was punishing those who deserved it. Gino began to talk again. He asked if the prince had changed his mind about keeping the human girl alive, and Orazio exhaled a tense breath. He was getting tired of this talk, but Gino continued. He said that sharing golden water with a human girl was not a wise decision, so the prince should think it over again. Orazio sat with a glass of holy water in his hands. He was already quite annoyed with Gino's constant complaints. His patience had run out. Orazio decided to teach the annoying servant a lesson and began to burn his soul with his intense gaze. The servant immediately began to cry out for mercy, for he was about to lose his soul. Orazio pardoned his servant and stopped staring. Gino breathed a sigh of relief. Then Orazio told him that this girl could look him straight in the eye. But Gino stood his ground. They had to get rid of the human girl soon. But when he realized what his master had said, his eyes widened in surprise. Could a human girl who looked directly into the eyes of the sun god survive? How could a human soul survive such a thing? The servant asked. That is why Orazio let her live. That's why Orazio wanted to save the girl's life, even if he had to force the food down her throat. Something disturbed Orazio, and he instantly disappeared from the room. Only an overturned glass on the floor reminded us of him. At that time, Radana went to the roof of the heavenly palace. There was only one thought in her head, why she had asked for mercy from the sun god. She was also disturbed by the scent of these flowers, which reminded her of the purpose for which they had been woven into her hair today. Radana went to the very edge of the roof. She knew that Nika had already left, and the other servants didn't care about her. So now no one could stop her. This was her only chance. When she looked down, her heart nearly stopped from fear. But she didn't want to live anymore. There were many difficulties in her life. But when they surrounded her, Radana would raise her eyes and look at the shining sun. It was the sun that gave her the strength to live. It was the very reason that made her fight on. She constantly dreamed of inhaling the scent of flowers and looking at the sunny sky, but the reality turned out to be quite the opposite of her imagination. Radana admitted to herself that she was always a hypocrite. Her life was always miserable, but she could not give up. She had an obsessive thought in her head that it might be better to die than to be stuck waiting for the future. Radana took a step and flew down. Just as her whole life was flashing before her eyes, and she was about to say goodbye to her own life, someone grabbed her in his arms. Radana looked up and saw that she had been saved by the sun god Orazio. He told her with a smile on his face that it was all a waste of time. Orazio explained to Radana that even if she had fallen and died, he would have brought her back to life anyway. So there is no need to do this in the future. He gently put her on the bed and told her that resurrection is a rather painful process, so she should not try it on herself. Then Prince Orazio took the most delicious fruit from the table. The girl held out her hands, which were trembling with fear and excitement. Instantly, the fruit was in her hands. Mentally, she said that now she could not even die. Radana looked at the juicy fruit and realized that she didn't even have the right to decide anything on her own anymore. So she just had to accept it and somehow get on with her life. Orazio said that he realized that the water nymph was not around when all this happened. Otherwise, he would have just cut off his head. After these words, he suggested that Radana eat something, and that if she didn't, Nika would face a sad end. From that day on, more servants looked after Radana. Every morning, Nika offered food to her mistress, and the girl ate with difficulty for the safety of her nymph. Despite the fact that Radana still had no desire to eat and drink, the holy water and food did their job, and Radana finally recovered. Orazio began to visit Radana more and more often without warning. Every time he saw Prince Nick, she would turn into a drop of water and disappear instantly. Radana endured Orazio's dry smiles and short conversations with him until it was time for bed. Orazio tried to make the most of their short and sparse communication. For 2 centuries, he had almost no contact with anyone, and the cursed blessing was to blame. Anyone who looked into the eyes of the sun, God died immediately. But Radana was different from other people. Although she was afraid of the prince, her soul did not suffer. Besides, Orazio could not read her mind, so he enjoyed the silence between them. He let Radana cry. Orazio knew that he could resurrect Radana again and again if she decided to commit suicide. Sometimes he even thought about sharing immortality with her. There was only one problem that bothered Orazio: Radana's lack of stamina. Orazio looked into his radiant's eyes and reminded her that it was time for bed. The girl agreed. This was the only thing Radana did not like. She didn't understand how she was supposed to fall asleep when she didn't want to. Radana always wondered why the sun god saved her life. Radana was constantly thinking about how it was very difficult to do nothing all day and then force herself to sleep. Nika was there in a flash. She told the hostess that Orazio had gone hunting. The maid asked if she could prepare a bath for Radana or if she wanted breakfast. Orazio insisted that Radana sleep as long as possible. He repeated that she was the only one who managed to survive in the heavenly palace. And only holy water gave the girl some vigor. The always sleepy Radana told Nikki that she was not feeling well. She asked the maid if there was anything she could do. Nika asked if Radana was bored. They could have sung or danced right then and there to comfort Radana. But Radana explained that she needed a job. Any kind of work: cleaning, cooking, washing fruit. She was willing to do anything. The nymph explained that members of the imperial family don't work, so it was out of the question. But Radana objected that she was not from their family. But Nika quietly said that Radana was His Highness's partner, so she was equivalent to a member of the imperial family. After these words, the nymph just shrieked and turned into water drops. The instantaneous disappearance of the maid was always caused by one reason: the appearance of Prince Orazio nearby. Yes. Orazio appeared in Radana's room and asked her how long she had been awake. The young girl mentally noted that the prince liked it when she reacted to his words in some way. So this time Radana began to smile in response. But Orazio noticed that something was bothering the young girl. So he came closer to her and asked her what was the reason for her mood. The girl replied that nothing was bothering her. Then Orazio leaned over Radana and said that he hated liars. Radina explained to the prince that the reason she was in a bad mood was the lack of any work. She could do different jobs. The girl asked him to assign her something. She assured me that she had very skillful hands, so she could do anything, even weave baskets or boxes out of papyrus. But the young man leaned closer, took her chin in his hands, and whispered that she didn't need to make anything out of any papyrus. He could give her anything she wanted, so her only job was to make sure she stayed in the heavenly palace. Radana once again noted for herself that sometimes his gaze is full of cruelty, madness, and boundless sadness. He told her to wait for him like a beautiful statue. That's the kind of errand he would have for her. That's all he asked of Radana. Then they turned their eyes simultaneously in the same direction. There, his favorite panther was approaching them. When the wildcat came closer to Orazio, he gently stroked it and said that they both did not need to look for any meaning in their existence. They were both his property, and it was for this reason that they both existed in this world for the time being. Prince Orazio was in a bad mood these days. Everyone around him noticed. Gino was also worried about his master and wondered why he was in such a shitty mood when he had achieved what he wanted. He could not understand His Highness at all. While walking through the celestial palace, Gino noticed a nymph collecting papyrus. The servant was very interested in this, so he stopped and decided to find out more about why she needed it. Gino approached the nymph and asked how the human was doing. Nika turned and said that he had scared her. She asked if his question was about Lady Radana's health. The nymph assured the servant that Lady Radana was perfectly fine. Then Gino added that a person who is in a heavenly palace cannot be all right in principle. Then the nymph agreed that perhaps all was not well with Lady Radana. Gino asked if Radana had told her that everything was not okay, or if it was Nika who had come to these conclusions. He also wanted to find out more specifically what makes a person unhappy. As Nika was gathering her thoughts and thinking about sharing her experiences with Gino, Prince Orazio approached her from behind. He asked if her name was really Nika. The nymph almost fainted from surprise and fear. She frankly admitted to the prince that her heart had almost stopped. Orazio then told Nikki that this was quite insolent and that she did not value her life at all. The girl said that she had no idea what His Highness was talking about. Orazio said that she had used Renum before their meeting, and that was why she couldn't think about Radana, which is an unheard-of audacity. The Rhinum is a shield for the mind, made of sulfur, gold, and ancient magic. The Rhinum allows you to temporarily hide your thoughts from Orazio's ears, as well as protect your soul from the prince's gaze. The excited and frightened nymph explained that she had no choice. She was worried that Orazio would take care of Lady Radana. Orazio was already in a bad mood, and this nymph added fuel to the fire. He asked how she dared to say that. Orazio began to think about what to do with this nymph. At first, he decided to kill her for her deed, but then he thought that Radana would faint again when she found out. Now, Orazio finally realized why he had been angry for the past few days. The reason for his shitty mood was the golden-haired beauty. But Orazio wasn't used to hearing no, so if he was determined to find out the truth, he would find out the truth at any cost. He took out the magic powder and scattered it over the nymph's head. Now he could clearly read all the nymph's thoughts. And she, in turn, was very sympathetic to Radana. The nymph was worried that the girl might jump off the balcony. Nikki felt sorry for Radana as she forced herself to eat, even when she was nauseated. Radana could not even leave the palace because His Highness blocked all the exits. Nika really wanted to help Radana, but Gino, the valet, warned her that Orazio would burn down her house if she made him angry. Lady Radana was unhappy. She was afraid of the third sun prince and forced herself to smile. That's what Orazio read in the nymph's mind, and then she fell to the floor of the celestial palace. Gino also asked Orazio that this was probably the reason why they had been having bad weather all month. It was all because of that man who was getting on the prince's nerves. After a moment's thought, Orazio ordered all the nymph's memories to be erased and more papyrus to be brought. When Gino asked why they needed the papyrus, His Highness explained that he should give it to the human girl. Gino asked the owner why he was fooling around with this girl and said that his family was wondering if he had spent the night with someone. So Gino was caught between two fires and didn't know what to say to whom. Orazio suggested that Gino visit the imperial palace tomorrow. The embarrassed servant asked why he wanted to go, and Orazio explained with a smile on his face that the visit to the imperial palace was necessary to show proof that the prince had been intimate. Upset, Radana stayed in her room as usual. She was not allowed to walk around the heavenly palace, so this was almost the only place where she always spent her time. Out of the corner of her eye, she glanced at the maids who were constantly watching the girl. She caught herself thinking that one day she would be like them, a soulless doll. Such thoughts regularly crossed Radana's mind as she sat and watched from the balcony of her room. Radana had been fighting hunger all her life. Her only wish was to take a sip of water. She almost lost her mind when she ate only one grass. But now everything is radically different. Her life has turned 180 degrees. Now Radana has a soft bed, the most delicious food and drinks. But there was only one question in her mind: why she was looking for a reason to live. The only thing Radana lacked was her will. She didn't want to just live, she needed freedom. When she was a child, her mother gave her false hope, and Radana was angry with her for that. Her mother said that one day Radana would be free, and that even after her death she would pray for it. The mother hoped that her daughter would experience all the joys that her mother had in her life. She hoped that her daughter would become a beacon in the darkness. Bitter tears began to fall. She had only now understood the full meaning of her mother's words and realized how wrong she had been to think that way. Radana was distracted from her heavy thoughts by the voice of her favorite maid. She showed her mistress a large pile of papyrus. The pleased nymph told Radana that she had brought something for her. Radana was both excited and scared at the same time. If His Highness found out about this, they would both be in trouble. But before Radana could tell him what the prince would do with them, she heard a familiar voice from behind her, saying that the nymph had his permission to do so. With a smile on his face, Orazio told Radana that she had wanted the papyrus, so here it was for her. Radana was very surprised, because until recently he had categorically refused to fulfill her request. His Highness extended his hand to Radana, and she shook it in return. She felt the warmth of his hand, and her soul felt cozy. So, holding hands, they walked closer to the papyrus across the hall of the celestial palace. Radana's heart began to beat furiously, and no matter how she calmed it, it did not listen to her mind. When she approached the papyrus and examined the pile, she mentally noted that there were too many. There was a whole mountain of papyrus in front of the girl. She wanted to ask why so many, but did not dare. Without letting go of her hand, Orazio looked directly into her eyes and asked her how she was feeling now. Radana was confused. She hadn't expected such a direct question, so she didn't know what to say to His Highness. Then she withdrew her hand and bowed. With her head down, she said she was very grateful to His Highness. When she looked up, she could see by the expression on Orazio's face that this was not the answer he had expected. So she was confused and began to think about what else she should have said. Orazio came close to the girl and took her face in his hand. He said that she should smile when she said words of gratitude. Radana's face showed a fake, tortured smile. She couldn't help but comply with the sun god's request, even though she didn't want to smile. Orazio also realized that the girl's smile was not sincere, and he was upset too. Radana began to tremble with fear, and she realized that Orazio's mood was beginning to deteriorate. He asked the girl why she claimed to want to live, when in fact she did not. His Highness explained that usually those who want to live constantly pray to the gods for this. At the same time, the girl fell to her knees in front of Orazio. Her body was trembling, and she couldn't do anything about it. Radana bowed her head to the floor and began to beg the sun god. Orazio thought he was going to hear the girl beg for longevity, or even immortality. But Radana looked up and clearly said that she asked him for only one thing: to kill her as soon as possible. Orazio raised his eyebrows in surprise and asked if the girl really wanted to die. And this was after all the effort and attempts to please Radana. Orazio reached out and lifted Radana off the floor. He could see that she was just shining, and it was at the time when the girl was between life and death. Orazio picked up the beauty and gently laid her on the papyrus feather bed. Then he leaned over the confused girl and said that he appreciated good manners, because he was a sunny prince after all. The girl lay on the papyrus as if hypnotized and kept her eyes on Orazio. Meanwhile, he slowly untangled her braids, playing with the beauty's golden hair. The girl was afraid that something indecent might happen, so she tried to stop Prince Orazio. She told him to stop, claiming that he was kind and polite. Orazio even smiled. It was funny to him to hear her flatter him like that. So he asked her if she really believed what she said. Orazio leaned down and whispered directly into her ear to ask her to kill herself again. If she did, he would take her right there. He knew it would be a more painful experience than death. Then the Prince of the Sun gently took her by the chin and told her that she could beg him for mercy. After Radana is supposed to ask him to give her life, he will try to save her and make her his forever. When he leaned down and touched her forehead with his lips, he could almost feel her thoughts. He knew that if she really wanted to die, she would not have wasted time thinking. After a moment, his lips moved lower from the girl's forehead. They met her lips and touched them gently. She did not resist such a passionate kiss. Her fingers intertwined with his, and she tightened her grip on his hand. After the kiss, Radana felt her whole body burning, as if she were on fire again. Her gaze met His Highness's passionate gaze. Orazio took her hand and told her that that was enough for today. Her body had to get stronger to be on par with his. Then, he brought her hand to his mouth and bit her finger. Radana cried out in pain and surprise. He gently looked her straight in the eyes, and she realized that this was what she needed. Blood began to drip from her finger. It dripped faster and faster. But Radana did not feel any pain. She did not even dare to move. Orazio placed the handkerchief under Radana's wounded finger. When the handkerchief was sufficiently soaked with blood, the prince handed it to a maid and told Gino to take it to his father. Then, he gently kissed her injured finger and told her to rest. The bleeding stopped immediately. A moment later, Orazio disappeared from her room, and she was left lying in the pile of papyrus. She could not yet recover from the recent events. Her heart wanted to jump out of her chest. Then the girl began to come to and realized that all the servants were in the room at that time. So they all witnessed what had just happened here. Radana almost burst into flames with shame. She immediately thought of Nika. If the nymph had seen it all, how could Radana look her in the eye? But before Radana could think of her nymph, she immediately appeared in the room. Nika apologized for having to leave the room. When Orazio suddenly appeared, she immediately disappeared. The nymph asked if her hostess was okay, and Radana breathed out a sigh of relief that Nika hadn't seen the shame that had taken place here a few minutes ago. Gino walked slowly toward the heavenly palace. Behind him, a servant was carrying a chest with some things. Gino said to himself that he knew this day would come one day. At the very gate to the palace, Gino's valet greeted Solo Lumen, the almighty son of the sun. He said that he had come here on behalf of Orazio Lumen and humbly requested an audience. In the main hall of the celestial palace, Solo Lumen sat on a throne with great authority. On either side of him were servants and representatives of noble families. Gino's valet bowed before the sun god and showed his respect for him. Solo Lumen said loudly that he hoped Gino had come here with good news. The valet began to mumble and couldn't explain why he had come here. The clever god Solo realized that they didn't need extra ears in this confidential conversation and kicked his right arm up in the air. Without further ado, his servant realized that they had to leave the hall and immediately rushed to fulfill the order of the sun god. Then the valet told me what exactly brought him to the palace to see Solo Lumen. Solo Lumen listened carefully and asked Gino who the girl was. After this question, drops of cold sweat appeared on Gino's forehead. He squinted his eyes and said with fear that the girl was human. Solo Lumen asked if Orazio had brought a sacrifice with him. Perhaps it was a priestess with special powers, as their ancient prophecy said. But Gino only said guiltily that Solo Lumen was wrong. This girl chosen by Orazio has nothing to do with the prophecy. Her divine powers are too small. Gino anticipated Solo's thoughts and asked if God thought that His Highness Orazio wanted to rebel against his father. But Solo Lumen reassured Gino. He said that Orazio was very close to him, despite his arrogance. Then the clever Solo asked Gino to make everyone think that this girl was a courtesan of the imperial court. Gino's eyes popped out of his head at this request, but Solo explained that Orazio would be appearing with this girl in the imperial palace anyway, so it would be better for everyone if they thought she was a courtesan. Gino agreed that this would be the best solution for everyone. Solo then went on to say that as soon as Orazio got tired of that girl, they would get rid of her right away. Solo Lumen sealed the contents of the box that Gino's valet had brought him and said it would be in this condition, because Solo Lumen did not want to fight his third son. A week after the events in the imperial palace, Radana woke up in her bed. She looked around for her maid. The nymph Nika immediately appeared and greeted her mistress. She was very worried about Radana because the girl had slept for a whole week, but Radana assured her maid that she was perfectly fine. By the way, Radana wanted to share one more piece of news with her nymph. The girl held out her right hand to the maid and showed her forearm. Radana explained that the stigma of being a white slave had disappeared, and her skin had become several times whiter and smoother. She was grateful to His Highness for finally giving them the right to choose, which had never happened before. Radana wondered why he had given her the right to choose and saved her life. Radian also had another request. She cheerfully told the maid that she was very hungry, so she asked the nymph to bring her breakfast. The nymph never dreamed of hearing such words from her mistress, so she said that she would, of course, bring the most delicious breakfast for Radana right away. Radana got out of bed and stretched sweetly. Today she felt much better than before. She thought to herself that it was only one kiss, and she seemed to have aged several years. Radana decided to share with the nymph that on Earth she was not a priestess, but an ordinary slave, and this stigma was proof that her social position was quite low. But after the kiss, Radana thought her life was fleeting, just like the stigma that disappeared from her skin in an instant. The nymph told Radana not to say such things about her life. After all, in the heavenly palace, everyone, except the gods, has an equal social position, and that Radana's past did not matter. Nika also added that Prince Orazio chose Radana as his mate, so everyone will have to respect Radana. Nika also said that Radana is the first lady to whom the nymph serves, so she is special to Nika, and the nymph is very happy to help Radana. Radana laughed cheerfully in response. They were very pleased to hear such words. She had never felt such warmth before, and this warmth began to melt her steely determination. So many new feelings and thoughts have accumulated over the past few days that Radana decided to go out on the balcony to think it over. The girl looked up at the sky and thought that maybe this was the last time she would be so lucky. She remembered Orazio's words that she needed to become stronger to be on the same level as the prince, and if her life depended on Orazio's will, then she must do what he asked. So Radana went over to the papyrus, which was lying in a pile in the middle of her room. She asked Nika to bring a knife and a hammer. From now on, she decided to do everything possible to do so. When His Highness and his valet entered the room, they remained standing in the doorway. They were very surprised by what they saw. Branches of papyrus were laid out on the floor, and the nymph and Radana were busily working on it. The nymph was the first to hear that guests had entered the room, so she turned her head and screamed in surprise. Nika rose from the floor and bowed her head to the Prince of the Sun. She greeted the distinguished guests and humbly awaited further orders. Orazio asked what it all meant, and Nika explained that she was helping Lady Radana tear the leaves from the papyrus trunk. Nika said that as soon as Lady Radana came to, she immediately started weaving baskets. The nymph asked the girl to rest, but it was no use. She would not listen to her maid. The valet started shouting that this was some kind of unheard-of mess. He could not even imagine how he could turn this stubborn woman into an elegant nymph. Orazio got tired of listening to his valet's whining, so he simply gagged him. Then he turned his attention to the beauty and thought that he shouldn't waste the rest of her energy on such a meaningless task. His Highness approached the girl and called out to her. She finally turned her head and noticed the men present. He said hello to Radana, and she happily answered him back. He asked if she recognized who was in front of her, and the girl answered that of course she did. Before her stood the third son of the sun god of the heavenly palace, who appreciates good manners. Radana explained to His Highness that she was working on his behalf, as he had asked. Orazio was surprised by her explanation. After all, as far as he remembered, he hadn't given her any instructions. Radana recalled how they talked about regaining strength, and she told him that she had skillful hands and could weave strong baskets. And after their conversation, Orazio himself asked the girl to do whatever she wanted. Orazio thought about it and began to remember their conversation. He had indeed said those things to the girl, but he had meant something else entirely. Then the young man held out his hands to her and asked her to show him. Puzzled, Radana handed the prince her best basket and waited for a favorable response. She had put a lot of effort into making it so beautiful. But Orazio said that he meant for her to show him her hands, not the basket, and Radana obediently put her hard-working hands in his palms. When her hands were in his warm hands, their eyes met. Radana blushed as the images of their kiss came back to her mind. Orazio noticed that she had gotten her hands dirty. The nymph pointed to the valet, who had something plastered over his mouth, and told His Highness that something was definitely wrong with Gino. Orazio remembered the valet and immediately opened his mouth. He had forgotten about this annoying servant while he was talking to Radana. Offended, Gino whispered that he had almost suffocated while waiting for the spell to be broken. It was good that at least Nika paid attention to him. He started chasing around the prince. While the valet was running around in circles, telling them what he had to endure, a strong wind started blowing. The girls made fun of this phenomenon, and Gino thanked them for the fact that now the papyrus would dry much faster. But the angry valet shouted that he would not stand for it any longer, and that he had no time to think about these stupid baskets. He had no idea how to turn Radana into a courtesan worthy of a heavenly palace. But Radana put the basket on her head and said that she was following the Sunny Prince's orders. This made Gino even angrier, and he shouted at her to stop doing it immediately. But the girl told him in a serious voice not to be familiar and to call her by her first name, Radana. Gino's mouth dropped open at this statement. He came closer to His Highness and asked him what had come over her, as he had said she had been sleeping for a week. Orazio confirmed that this was the case, so Gino suggested that perhaps the girl had hit her head somewhere, and Orazio also wondered what had happened to the modest Radana. Orazio stood silently and went over all the possible options in his head. He had no idea how the woman who had begged him to die a week ago could have changed so dramatically. The Sunny Prince wondered how it was that a broken and desperate girl turned out to be such an avid basket weaver. But only one thing was clear. Radana looked incredibly happy. Radana approached His Highness and asked him if he had any more errands for Radana, and if so, she would certainly try to fulfill them. Gino then asked loudly if Lady Radana could play any of the musical instruments. Radana stood there with a basket in her hands and just blinked her eyes. Then Gino asked her if she could recite poetry, if she knew how to dance, or if she could sing well. The valet slapped his hand on his head and angrily asked what she was capable of doing if she couldn't even do that. Then Radana pulled the pretty basket closer to the valet and said that she was good at weaving strong baskets. This carelessness almost made Gino explode with anger. Then he handed Radana several manuscripts and told her to carefully study everything that was written there and not to use any stupid baskets. Upset, Gino told Orazio late in the evening that Radana could neither sing nor dance. Therefore, it is unlikely that he will be able to pass her off as a graceful nymph. He suggested that priestesses are not that elegant. Orazio told the valet that this girl was not a priestess. She was a slave on earth. This news completely shook the ground from under Gino's feet. He hadn't even realized it. So he suggested that perhaps they should visit Mr. Magus. But Orazio said that Mr. Magus lived on a high mountain, so he would have to climb it with the girl. The valet said they had no other choice. The Imperial Festival is only a month away, so they have to act now. Gino told Orazio that he would rather climb a high mountain with the girl than be struck by lightning when everyone found out that the prince had chosen a human. Orazio said that tomorrow they would have guests from the palace. Her Highness is sending traders for trial again. It is for this reason that Gino and Radana must leave the palace early in the morning so that no one can smell Radana. The next morning, before sunrise, Radana was already sitting in a comfortable carriage, full of positive emotions and anticipating a fabulous adventure. It was her first ride. The carriage reached the foot of Mount Kor. Then they were forced to continue their journey on foot. Radana enjoyed every step of the way. She had been confined to a small space for so long that when she found herself here, she tried to use every opportunity. During the walk, Radana remembered that Orazio had come to her bedroom this morning. Although she was asleep, she could feel his warm fingers touching her body through her sleep. She began to wonder why he had come to see her, because he had disappeared without saying anything before she woke up. Radana noticed that the valet was having a hard time walking, so she called him. When Gino stopped and asked what she needed, Radana sat down and offered to carry the valet on her shoulders. But the valet, as usual, began to whine that he was too old for this. After considering such a tempting offer, the valet agreed to take advantage of the opportunity and sat comfortably on the gentle girl's shoulders. After walking for several kilometers, Gino cheerfully announced that they were almost there. All that was left was to pass a large stone. The nymph came closer to the hostess and said that Lady Radana had done a good deed. But the girl said it was nothing. Radana folded her arms and closed her eyes. She said she liked it here because she could enjoy the sound of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the singing of birds, and the breeze. But her relaxation was interrupted by the shout of the valet, who called the girls to follow him. Nika said that sometimes Gino acts like a nasty old man. Then Radana asked how old he really was. The nymph thought for a while and said that the valet was 500 years old, or even more. The girls stopped talking and went to catch up with the valet. When they got behind the big stone, Magus was already waiting for them. He carefully examined Radana and said that when he heard that His Highness had chosen a companion, he thought she would be like the nymph of Aphrodite. But in fact, this companion turned out to be an ordinary person. But the valet wanted to stand up for her and said that the girl was luckily smarter than she looked, which is why they came to him. Frightened, Gino blurted out whether Mr. Magus understood that His Highness wanted to be close to this man. Magus reassured everyone that he was joking, and they should just stay close to him. Then, no one would dare to touch them. The frightened Gino could only reply that Mr. Magus was not very good with jokes, to put it mildly. But Mr. Magus went a step further and invited everyone to do the same. Finally, after a long and arduous journey, they arrived at Mr. Magus's house. The polite centaur said that they were probably hungry from the journey, so he offered them a treat. But he had to get back to work. When they started eating, Radana said that Mr. Magus was very kind. Gino objected and said that after such a hard journey, he could offer something better than beer and venison. The nymph noted that she had heard that Mr. Magus was the wisest man in their empire, so it was no wonder he had so many scrolls around the house. Gino only replied that there was nothing impressive about it. For example, he had known all this for a long time, so he didn't need those scrolls. After he said that, Radana laughed. Gino asked her why she was laughing, and Radana explained that the valet was just amazing. Gino was so pleased to hear such a compliment that his face immediately turned red. Nika noticed this and asked him why he was blushing. The girls looked around Mr. Magus's room. On the table were working tools and scrolls with some important documents. Radana suggested that Mr. Magus must be very busy. Gino angrily replied that he must be. Finishing his mug of beer, Gino said that Magus was a rude eccentric and also the chief sage in Povius. Then, tired from such a long journey, Gino sat down on the floor and said that Magus was not up to them now, so they could sleep. Radana reassured the nymph that everything would be fine, but before going to bed, she had to make them a more comfortable bed. She gathered some herbs and tried to make a place for them to rest. At that time, Orazio was carrying out another punishment of traitors. Pericles, who was his mentor and the father of his friend, was kneeling before him. It was hard to believe that he had betrayed the empress. Orazio was very tired of this work. His hands were covered in blood. But his thoughts were far away. His thoughts immediately turned to Radana, who was sleeping sweetly. At the same moment, he found himself next to his beauty, who was resting in Mr. Magus's house. He looked at her tenderly and thought that she didn't like to look him in the eye when she was talking either. So he wanted to rest in her arms for a moment. In the imperial garden, the most influential women of the empire gathered at the dinner table. They decided to discuss the latest news during lunch. In the center of the table sat the purebred and direct heir to the goddess Hera, Empress Avaritia Lumen. She had to be aware of all the latest news of the empire, so such dinners were held regularly. The table was discussing recent events, and of course the most important one was that the third prince had finally become a man. They were interested in what family he had decided to marry. The women asked the empress if she knew who he had chosen to take his virginity. The empress replied that the family did not matter, as Orazio would marry the one they chose. She then asked Tara if she agreed with the empress's statement. Tara was her niece. The pleased niece said that everyone would find out at the imperial festival, and no one cares what His Highness thinks. Lumen raised her glass high and proposed a toast to such a successful event. She hoped that everyone present would join them. Everyone raised their glasses to bless the first woman whom Prince Orazio, the shining jewel of the Povius Empire, had chosen. The women drank their drinks with pleasure. When the meal was over, the empress was the first to leave the table. Then all the important women began to leave the dinner table. Tara was furious. She didn't like the fact that the sunny prince chose some unknown person for the first night, not a woman from the Pyros family, but some unknown person. Her niece's displeasure was interrupted by the empress, who asked her to stop her monologue. Lumen's accident ordered a maid to fill a glass with wine. When the empress was handed the glass, she assured her niece that she need not worry about anything at all, because Orazio would marry her anyway. Tara listened to the empress very carefully. She did not want to share the prince with any woman, for she had mentally married him long ago. Avalanche Lumen said that for now Oration is like a dog in Saul Lumen's hands, but she can swear that soon he will belong to Terry. In the morning, when the nymph came to her mistress, she noticed that Radana was not feeling well. Nika didn't know what to do, so she looked for someone who could help her. The nymph asked the valet what they should do now, because Radana had a fever. Nika blamed it on Gino, because it was Gino who Radiant had been carrying up the mountain on his shoulders all the way. Gino argued and assured her that it was not his fault, because he had not asked her to do it. He could have gotten out on his own, without any help. At this noise, which was heard a few meters away, Mr. Magus came and asked what was going on. The nymph asked for the centaur's help because Radana was sick. Mr. Magus came closer to the girl and touched her forehead. She had a high fever, so Magus said it was because she was overworked. The nymph asked if he was sure of his diagnosis, and Mr. Magus said that they needed hibiscus tea with cinnamon for treatment. It would quickly put the girl back on her feet. Mr. Magus said that he would cook it himself. He has all the necessary ingredients for this. The centaur went to his room to get the necessary ingredients for the healing tea. He was sure that because of Radana's carefulness and hard work, she was born under the sign of Venus. When the potion was ready, Mr. Magus carefully poured it into the cup. He said he would start his lessons when the girl was better. Lady Radana opened her eyes. She could hear the sound of raindrops, so she asked if it was really raining outside. Radana asked where His Highness was now, and Nika replied that Orazio was in his palace, and they were in Mr. Magus's cave. But Radana was sure that at night she felt the presence of the sunny prince. It was he who hugged her. It was his gentle warmth that she felt. But if the nymph claims that Orazio is in the palace at that time, then perhaps Radana dreamed it all, although it was so realistic, as if it were real. When Radana got out of bed, she asked where Gino was, and the nymph replied that she hadn't been interested in the old man, so she didn't know where he was now. At this time, the girls heard the voice of the Valish himself, who asked the nymph if she was hoping that something had happened to him. Then Gino handed Lady Radana a bouquet of green grass. He said he had picked it for Radana. Radana asked what it was, and Gino explained that he had brought her a papyrus, the one she had asked Orazio for. The nymph said that if he had brought Radana an apple, it would have been more useful. It was at this point that the girls heard Mr. Magus's voice asking if the ladies were awake, and the nymph said that she had completely forgotten that Magus had asked her to show her something interesting. So the girls went to another room, where the centaur was at that time. When they went inside, they saw Magus skillfully working with silverware. A few minutes later, his skillful hands revealed a cup of elegantly crafted mug. It was so beautiful that it was impossible to look away. Radana even opened her mouth in surprise. She wondered how Magus could have created such a bowl out of silver. Then Mr. Magus turned his head in Radana's direction and asked her if she would like to try to create one in silver. The angry valet shouted at Magus that he had asked him to make Radana into a graceful nymph, not a blacksmith. But Mr. Magus explained that he wanted everyone to gossip about this beauty. The world will know about Radana as the heir to Circe. After careful training, Lady Radana will become a master craftsman who creates incredible things out of metal. The nymph thought about what he had said and asked him what exactly Gino had disliked about the stones. He could have kept his thoughts to himself. Mr. Magus suggested that Radana start studying, so he told her to pay close attention and repeat after him. Her hands took the silver chains and repeated exactly all the movements made by the concentrated Magus. After a few minutes and skillful movements, Radana held a silver rose of incredible beauty in her palms. The surprised valet and nymph could not take their eyes off such beauty. They could only compliment and admire the girl's fabulous skills. Magus was also pleased with how the girl could quickly master such a difficult skill, so he asked the audience for their opinion on the matter. When Magus heard that everyone liked their work of art, he told them that Prince Orazio had visited him that night. So Magus will do his best not to disappoint the prince. These words struck Radana the most. So Prince Orazio was here tonight after all, and the fact that he was lying next to her, and she felt his warmth was not a dream.